Hi. We've had a couple of really rich, really brilliant papers this morning. I'm going to throw something quite different into the mix, and then we'll just see what you make of it and where we go. In 2014, the Russian filmmaker Andrei Zvagintsev released Leviathan to international critical acclaim. It was given the Best Screenplay Award at Cannes and nominated as Russia's entry for the Best Foreign Language Film at the Oscars. Despite having been partially funded by the Ministry of Culture, institutional reception of Leviathan in Zvagintsev's homeland was nonetheless decidedly rocky. The Culture Minister Vladimir Medinsky lamented its existential hopelessness, complaining, and I quote, that there is not a single positive hero and the characters are not real Russians. An official from the Orthodox Church concluded in his words that it's obvious that it's made to cater for a Western audience, or rather, the Western elite. The reasons for their complaints are not hard to work out. Leviathan presents an utterly grim portrayal of alcoholism, domestic abuse, and corruption. The last of these focusing on a story of secret collusion of local state officials and the Orthodox Church to steal land from the central character. The collapse in Nikolai's fortunes evoke parallels with the biblical figure of Job, a parallel encouraged through various appearances of a whale and explicit reference to the divine Whirlwind speeches in a scene quite late on in the film, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, Western reviewers generally focused on the kind of what they saw as the Russian specificities of the tone and story. One reviewer for the Guardian newspaper remarking, Leviathan could not be more forthrightly Russian if a bear were to waltz through its opening credits playing a balalaika. But the original inspiration for the film was in fact a 2004 event in which Marvin John Haymeyer, a mechanic living in Colorado, bulldozed a town hall, a mayor's house, and a range of other buildings after a local land dispute. He also planned to destroy the local church, but after his machine got stuck, he ended up ending his own life with a shotgun. Zvagintsev was struck by this outpouring of vivid public rage at government and church and reframed the story for a Russian setting, only then adding in kind of allusions, references to Hobbes and Job. Now, importantly, Zvagintsev has said in an interview that, I quote, "We were by no means trying to illustrate the story of Job. It's more a matter of allusion." And with that in mind, in this paper, I'm not going to precisely attempt to kind of decode Leviathan's intended retelling of the book of Job, as I just don't think that's what Zvagintsev's really kind of consciously doing. Rather, I want to think a bit more creatively about bringing Leviathan into dialogue with the biblical story and think about how it feeds into potential discussions of state oppression, obfuscation, and notions of fake news versus reality. But it makes sense, though, to begin with Leviathan's one really direct and explicit reference to the book of Job. It comes quite late in the film as Nikolai, the central character, has an encounter with a local priest. Let's see if this will work.
Probably need to go. Go for it.
No.
Ну и чё? Где твой Бог милосердный?
Мой-то со мной, а вот где твой, не знаю. Кому ты молишься? В церкви я тебя не видел. Не постишься, не причащаешься, на исповедь не ходишь.
Если бы я свечки ставил, поклоны был, мне бы все по-другому было. Может, сейчас начать, пока не поздно. Может, жена моя воскресит. Дом не вернут. Или поздно уже.
Не знаю. Пути Господи неисповедимы.
Не знаешь. А что тогда на исповедь даешь? Что ты вообще тогда знаешь? Будешь?
Нет. Можешь ли ты уже вытащить Левиафана и веревкой схватить за язык его? Будет ли он тебя умолять? Будет ли разговаривать с тобой кротко? На земле нет подобного ему. Он царь над всеми сынами гордости.
Василий, я же с тобой по-человечески. Что мне ходить будешь? Зачем?
Может, знаешь, был такой человек, Иов, как и ты задавался вопросом о смысле жизни. Да как же это, почему именно со мной? До того себя довел, что коростой покрылся. И жена пыталась меня править, и друзья говорили, не гневи Бога. А он все равно пылил и спал голову первым. Тогда Господь смилостивился и сам явился к нему в виде урагана. И популярно все объяснил ему в картинках.
Ничего.
И смирился Иов. Жил 140 лет. Видел сынов сыновей до 4-го колена. И умер в старости, насыщенный днями.
Сказка, что ли?
Да нет, и в Библии написано.
You got any more footage?
A little bit.
Do you want me to sit down?
Is that all right? Yeah. Cool. Now, as it turns out, Nikolai's life does not get better at all. Zvigintsev had originally thought of him going on a destructive rampage akin to Marvin John Haymeyer in Colorado, but then decided that this would be too close to an inappropriately happy ending. And instead, it is Nikolai's house that gets demolished, he gets imprisoned, and a new Orthodox church is built upon his land. But returning to the issue of the divine speeches from Job, although they're kind of directly referenced in that scene I just showed you, I suggest that the clearer narrative parallel between the speeches and Leviathan is with the kind of mode in which Nikolai is at various points bullied and baffled by the state. Earlier in the film, the local mayor arrives unannounced at his house to declare his superiority over Nikolai and his family. You're all insects. You always have to make things difficult, don't you? And near the outset of the film, we're also introduced to the kind of tedious, confusing, and oppressive language of official bureaucracy. And it's worth showing you actually a few minutes from an early courtroom scene, just so you kind of get a sense of the tone. I'm not sure what the volume's going to be like. You should just... Can we turn it up a bit? So it goes on for ages. And it just varies. They cut away a little bit, and then it just slowly pans closer and closer. But it goes on for kind of so long that you're kind of, you can kind of, it gets boring and then funny and then boring again, and it just kind of grinds you down. But for the viewer, it's also quickly apparent that the arguments and language of this whole scene But for the viewer, it's also kind of quite quickly apparent that this courtroom monologue is fundamentally contentless. Because unbeknownst to Nikolai, the state actions destroying his life are being orchestrated behind closed doors by the mayor and the local church leader. Now, the situation is, of course, kind of comparable to the book of Job, in which, as attentive readers of the divine whirlwind speeches might recall, the real reasons for Job's suffering are not complicated at all, and have been revealed to the reader, but not the protagonist, in the opening chapters of the book. In the heavenly realm, God and the Satan make plans to test a particular conundrum regarding the relationship between piety and plenitude, and then neglect to ever provide Job with the comparatively simple reason for his travails. Despite the role of the church in Nikolai's suffering, one thing that Leviathan does make very clear to viewers is the role of the state as creator of suffering. And this is obviously a dimension kind of absent from the biblical text. Behind the mayor's desk hangs a prominent portrait of Vladimir Putin, and when Nikolai and family friends go for a barbecue, they take photographs of state leaders as target practice for a makeshift firing range. In Leviathan, in other words, it is state institutions rather than God directly that lie behind the destruction of the protagonist's happiness. Now, I'm aware there's quite a lot of different ways we could potentially think through this, and we'll see what happens in discussion afterwards. But I'd like to briefly jump sideways to a text written by the Israeli political philosopher Adi Ophir in his book 2 Essays on God and Disaster. Now, the first of these essays by Adi Ophir, entitled Divine Violence, is notable for having inspired contemporary artist Adam Brumberg and Oliver Shanarin to produce their 2013 kind of award-winning artwork, Holy Bible, in which copies of the King James Bible were kind of overlain with photographs of state violence. Brumberg and Shanarin were so taken with Ophir's Divine Violence essay that they even pasted copies of his essay into the back of their reworked Bibles. Ophir's logic is comparatively simple, and it is that the biblical narrative portrays God as the creator of and saviour from destructive acts. This is a role, Ophir argues, that is then kind of inherited by the state. He writes, I quote, "On the one hand, the state has become a potential or actual generator and facilitator of large-scale disasters, and the destructive power of some states has been brought to perfection. On the other hand, the state has become the facilitator, sponsor, and coordinator of assistance, relief, and survival in times of disaster. In both cases, the state has taken, or might seem to be taking, God's role as chief author of destruction and ultimate agent of providence." Now, God or state as author of destruction and salvation nicely brings us to one of the obvious differences between Leviathan and the book of Job. Namely, the severe kind of divergence of fortune found at their endpoints. While Job lives out his long final years in wealth and happiness, the downward trajectory of Nikolai's situation remains unaltered. The distinction is drawn into focus by Nikolai's encounter with the Job-quoting priest I showed earlier, and his dubious suggestion that if he merely accepted his fate, then contentment and long life would follow. But I suggest one way to kind of think about this is to consider the divine whirlwind speeches of chapter 38 to 42, and then the following restoration of Job as a kind of unified block of rhetoric, just for the purposes of today. It is a mythology of prosperity, whereby if you just sit back and endure confusion, you'll end up with long life, wealth, beautiful daughters, and plentiful livestock. But in Leviathan, the connection between the divine speeches and the happy ending has been severed. Nikolai is crushed by confusing bureaucracy and bullying officialdom, and the ultimate outcome is realistically dire. Zvigintsev doesn't even allow Nikolai the transitory joy of bulldozing a couple of civic buildings. Yet what Fear's essay doesn't really deal with is the intersection between oppression and kind of deliberate obfuscation. That's so kind of tyranny married to strategic confusion. Zvigintsev, the director of Leviathan, has this notion very much in mind, and in some interviews on the film offered scathing criticism of a notion that he should simply sort of sit back and endure corruption in the government and the church. He said, "Either you understand you're responsible for telling the truth or not. Either you do something or you do nothing, and then have to carry it through. That's how I see it. All you can draw comfort from is that it is your duty to tell the truth." And yet, if Zvigintsev sees his film as an act of truth-telling, this gets complicated and tangled up in how the film portrays ways in which rhetoric of truth and lies become mobilized as an oppressive force. In the penultimate scene of Leviathan, another priest gives a sermon to the mayor and to other kind of gathered dignitaries as they stand together in the new church built on the site of Nikolai's old house. I'll play you another clip. But note the way in which Zvigintsev places fervent appeals to truth, very similar to his own, in fact, in the mouths of characters we as viewers know are schemers and liars. Again, it's another scene where it does go on for a long time, and they kind of slightly overwhelm the viewer a little bit. Let's see, does it move on? So Zvigintsev's own appeals to truth-telling are kind of wrapped up in a critique of those who appeal to truth dishonestly. But stepping back from Leviathan itself, the problem, of course, is that when engaging with our own real lives, we are not granted the viewer or the reader's point of view. We are mired in declarations of honesty, denunciations of fake news, and mythologies of universally accessible prosperity. Like Job or Nikolai, we are embedded in the narrative. Now, ultimately, it's not really Zvigintsev's responsibility to get out of this bind, something suggested by his own attitude towards filmmaking and Leviathan in particular. In one interview, he says the following. He says, "Film is not an algebraic equation. It is a projection of your impressions and your intuition, your irrational responses to things that are happening around you. When you have the need to respond to some challenge, and I call the story of Marvin John Hayermeyer exactly a challenge because this was a story of a downtrodden justice, story of downtrodden man's rights to justice, you come up with such a response." So Leviathan is a film that ultimately offers very little by way of a kind of pathway out of despair. But I'd suggest that whether Zergintsev precisely intended it or not, and I think it's worth noting I've kind of packaged things probably a little bit tidier than they really are, whether he intended it or not, it does offer a way of kind of rethinking about the book of Job as a tale of divine stroke state obfuscation, of divine stroke state oppression. Now, this is not, I should stress, a way of responding to the film that has occurred among the other kind of scattered academic treatments of Leviathan that I'm aware of. Writing in the American Journal of Religion and Film, Denis Kondyuk, thinking about the imagery of the Leviathan itself, concludes that, I quote, "The whale's bones are a sign of transcendent justice that will come one day on everybody, illuminating the idea that no monster is infinite. If there is God, there is hope." Now, it's entirely possibly a reflection of my own predispositions that I'm just not sold on this kind of upbeat theology. The way I've suggested Leviathan might dialogue with the Book of Job is also way out of sync with kind of classic political liberation readings of the past. Gustavo Gutierrez's much discussed commentary on Job contained many an appeal to fight oppression of the poor in South Africa, but his view of the divine speeches is one bound in notions of mystery and free will defense. Responding to the divine speeches, he reflected that the all-powerful God is also the weak God. The mystery of divine freedom leads to the mystery of human suffering. The Argentinian liberation theologian Enrique Dussel, in his essay on Job and US foreign policy and oppression in Central America, described the situation in following terms. He said, "The sinners are the military, the ruling class, the United States. They are the active subject of sin. The suffering people, Job, are convinced of the essence of revelation, that God does not do wrong, and wrong is the product of domination." But thinking in kind of relation to Leviathan, I'm suggesting, we end up with a vision of Job's God that is not liberator, but template for state oppression. As I mentioned before, the film was inspired by an event that took place in Colorado in 2004, only to be kind of reformulated into a critique of Russian governance in Zvigintsev's 2014 film. In 2017, we might, in conclusion, briefly turn back to the United States, as we've kind of reached a slightly strange reading of Job with kind of inflections of the American dream, at least as it's being articulated in some currently rather high-profile guises. God went to an Ivy League school. He knows the words. He knows the best words. If you just relax and let him take the reins, he'll make creation great again with wealth, long life, amazing deals, attractive daughters, luxury golf clubs, beautiful pieces of chocolate cake, everything. Taken to its logical endpoint, the speeches from the divine whirlwind may be a kind of swirling vista of alternative facts. God is imbued with Trumpian bluster, and the Book of Job is recast as political satire. I'll end it there.